Welcome everybody to live Q&A. This is Pastor and the Recovering Heretic. I am Pastor Dave.
And I am the Recovering Heretic, Dan.
Dan. Okay. Hi, Dan. What's our topic today?
Our topic today, Abraham.
Abe.
Abram.
Good old Abe.
Good old Abe.
Yeah.
Just from today's reading,
Mm-hmm.
which I know it's probably coincidental, but I think it's really cool that we had this reading as we're coming out of the Hajj and the Eid al-Hajj, which is all about, celebrating Abraham, Isaac, recognizing that.
Right.
And the Hajj itself, when you go to the Kaaba, built by Abraham.
Yeah. Right.
So all that, I thought the timing is perfect then, because this all dovetails. And because Abraham is so central to three of the world's major religions, it just seemed appropriate to find out. And he is the patriarch of three religions. So who is this guy?
Yep.
So who is he? Tell us the basics of Abraham. There's a lot that I find intriguing about it. And I'll broadly cover them, then we'll get to specific questions. But one, as a kid, I always imagined Abraham was like almost in prehistory, like Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
But then you study and you realize, no, civilization had been around for like 1,000 years by then.
Right. He's not before history. He's early Bronze Age.
Yeah.
Probably, maybe late, maybe like early Iron, depending on where you put him in the timeline.
But he's there in the cradle of civilization in Mesopotamia.
Right. He's from right? Which is one of the first cities.
Yeah. Big trading city, in fact, in the region.
Yeah. So
frankincense and myrrh were some of the big exports.
They were
from
So who knows? He wanders a lot. God's comment on him once is, he says later to the people, he says, your ancestor was a wandering Aramean and I found him. So don't think too highly of yourself.
So he's giving us a put down right away.
Yeah, right. Don't. It's a really funny line. Your ancestor was a wandering Aramean, and I plucked him out of the.
Well, and was he at the time? Wasn't he based out of Ur, or was he like a? Did he run caravans?
He starts in but they're pretty mobile. So, there's another stop where I forget the name of the place in the story. His father before him is also mobile.
So they weren't actually city dwellers of Ur. It was more like a base of operations.
Yeah, right. That's what it seems like. The Bible later describes them as living in tents and, herds, kind of nomadic herdsmen, semi-nomadic herdsmen that kind of circled around the city, which would have been a pretty common thing, So that kind of seems to be what he was. He was very mobile, very always kind of wandering to and fro, So it's not like he owns a mansion somewhere. He has great mobile flocks.
Yeah.
That kind of.
He has a man's tent.
Yeah, right. He has a big tent and kind of wanders with his sheep and all his stuff,
So his wealth is in his livestock, essentially?
Yes, it's livestock. Most wealth is livestock in the ancient world. It's kind of like stocks today. So, they're insurance, right? You can kill them if things get really bad for meat. You can milk them. You use their, if they're sheep, you can shear them. Like there are a variety of things you can do going from the very bad, like when things get really bad, you could just kill them and eat them to, milk them and all that good stuff. So, so they're kind of like today. You have stocks, and if things get financially bad, you sell a little bit of your IRA, and that kind of thing.
If things are good, you just take the dividends and live off that.
Right. Exactly. Okay. So,
what about his age? Both his own physical age when the story begins, and the age of civilization. What year does this start taking place?
I forget what year it is. I'd have to look it up. I seem to recall it's like Bronze Age, kind of in that early, before 1000 BC
Yeah. But not too far before because it's not Stone Age.
Yeah, it's not Stone Age. It's not, right.
We've got writing by this point.
Right, we've got writing, all that good stuff. It's not like, right, it's not proto-civilization. It's civilization, it's that first stuff you learned in Western Civ courses, that's kind of his era. So, and then, is do what you will with the age. The Bible says he had a kid at 100, is when Isaac finally came. And then it seems like it was like 20, 25 years when he first got the promise of Isaac, and a little bit before that when God told him to pick up and go,
So he was already late career. Basically, it was 60s or 70s.
Yeah,
all this starts.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. He's not a young man, which is a lesson for all of us. You're never too old to retire from church.
Yeah.
So
or start.
Right. Or start. Yeah.
And you mentioned
he's married to Sarah. That's his wife. We should mention her.
Yeah.
Sarah's his wife.
Now, why do they both end up having a name change, right? So we have Sarai and Abram, and then it's Sarah and Abraham after.
Yeah. The Bible, God does this pretty frequently, that names get changed with calling, that it changes your identity, right? So, Peter's actually Simon, right? But
then he becomes the Rock.
Right, but then he's Peter,
Which just occurred to me by, Peter meaning the Rock, that he beat Dwayne Johnson by like 20,000,
yes,
2,000 years.
By 2,000 years, right? Dwayne Johnson should be paying us royalties. Right. So, So Abraham gets changed. Abram gets changed into Abraham. Sarai gets changed into Sarah. Jacob becomes Israel.
Yeah.
God does this.
Saul becomes Paul.
Right. Well, Saul's issue is Saul's his Hebrew name and Paul is his Greek name.
Ah, okay. So that's just a one-to-one.
Right. That's just this is what he was, and because he's dual citizenship and kind of lives in both worlds.
Yeah.
So
now, is there a change then in meaning? Did Abram mean one thing and Abraham means another?
It does, but I forget what Abraham's name means. Sarah means laughter. That's when her name gets changed, is when God says, "You're going to have a kid," and she laughs.
Yeah, but she was laughing kind of sardonically, wasn't she?
Yeah. Well, right. Like, haha. Yeah, right. So, and that's also part of it, right? Like, name changes are kind of this ironic thing God does, to be like, you laugh now, you're going to be laughing.
Well, and speaking of names, when you said Abraham finally had a kid at 100, Isaac, you said. And it's like, Isaac.
Yeah.
Why is Ishmael chopped liver? I mean, come on.
Yeah, he's not.
I mean, and I've heard the argument of, well, she's more of a consort than a wife, but
yeah.
But it actually reads as his wife, that Sarah wanted him to marry, make it more legitimate, Hagar.
So it's almost like surrogate is kind of, it's a surrogate. Okay. Think of her as think of her as a awful combination between servant, sexually harassed person, and surrogate, is kind of how you got to think of Hagar. Ishmael, not that he's chopped liver, and God actually enfolds him in the promise. If you read Ishmael's story, God comes to Hagar and saves Hagar, and God says, this will be part of it too, right? Mm-hmm. You will be descended. You will also be the ancestor of many peoples.
Yeah.
And so it's actually quite a beautiful point that in a not great moment, even God can still manage to enfold those moments into the greater picture.
Yeah.
It's what Paul means when he says all things work together for good for those who love God. Not that all things are good, like it's a hard story, but that God can enfold even those hard parts. It's like, okay, this is not what we had in mind, but even this shall be, enfolded into the promise. Like, we'll put this in, we'll work with it.
Yeah. Well, and it's the whole point then the Arabs feel that they are descended directly from Ishmael.
Yeah, right. And so there's a,
right. And then you have Israelites.
Right. There's an intractable conflict there.
Well, and that's what I wonder about. Why should there even be a conflict? Because they're just from two different brothers.
Yeah, it has to do
and
with...
then you have the 12 tribes of Israel from different brothers. So if that can be all cohesive and together.
It has to do with tracing the idea of promise, who receives the promise, right, is kind of the issue at stake. Who are the promised people? Who receives the promise? Because there is this thing of, this is the other part of it, like, the scandal of the Old Testament is that God is... the scandal of the New Testament is Jesus died on the cross, right? Like that's the part that's hard to wrap your mind around. The scandal of the Old Testament is that God is particular. This brother, not that brother. This people, not that people. For whatever... it doesn't mean he doesn't love everybody, but for whatever reason, Jacob gets chosen, not Esau.
So it's time and time again.
Yeah,
it starts with Ishmael and...
right. There's Ishmael and there's Isaac. Well, it started with Cain and Abel, right? I mean, there's Abel chosen, not Cain. No explanation given. It's just, it is the nature of God that he is particular.
That he plays favorites.
Yeah. Yes.
And that... okay, I'm going to get back to that in a minute.
Well,
because each answer gives me like 5 threads of questioning to follow.
Yes.
But I want to get back before it gets too long that Renee has some observations that do relate to other questions that I had. And one of the ones I wanted to wonder about was this whole concept of blood sacrifice and why that was so important. It seems so primitive and so pantheon style, old school God worship, where the gods were very limited. Yeah. And yet we have Abraham's God that we're still doing the blood sacrifice with. But Renee asked, was there expectation of sacrifice on a regular basis? For example, monthly or weekly?
Oh.
Or was blood sacrifice like this only for special occasions?
No, I mean, there was a regular schedule, probably not as formal before the temple, and the organized religion aspect of it. But yeah, you would be it would not be rare, to have to find the lamb and stuff like that,
And what was the point? Because there's passages of the Bible that talk about it as if the burning smoke is actually nutrition, like the Greek god's ambrosia that God requires. Like he'll get weak if he doesn't get this smoke coming up to him.
Right.
And that, again,
seems
such very limited, small.
Yeah.
That's not a big deity if you have to do that.
Yeah. I guess I would say, I mean, there's lots of different aspects to it, there's a kind of, why do we worship, right? Like at all, God doesn't actually need it.
Yeah. Well, and there's that old fantasy sci-fi trope that the gods, it's like the human energy of worship that gives the gods their power.
The Clash of Titans, right?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So if you stop worshiping, they get weak and fade away.
Yeah, fade away. No. That's nonsense.
Not how this works.
Not how this works. Like we are beings created for worship. That's why we worship. So on a certain level, we sacrifice because we're created, because we are created to worship, and that's part of worship. And to this day, right? We don't sacrifice animals, but we sacrifice. You spend more time doing this, and you spend a lot of time at church, right? You sacrifice time, you sacrifice money here. I sacrifice time and money. We all do. Like we do it because it's how we worship, and we have to worship because worship and praise is about acknowledging that there is something bigger than us.
It seems like we struggle in figuring out really how we should acknowledge that something that is bigger than us.
Yeah, it is hard, right? I mean, it is really hard, right? It's not a simple prospect, and we kind of want to fool ourselves because, okay, we acknowledge it's bigger than us, but then there are lots of conclusions to that belief that are also to help us that are supposed to go along with it that we often don't, right? God, there is something bigger than me, therefore they are bigger than my problems. That's hard. Like there's
because to me, my problems are bigger than anything on the planet.
Right, exactly. Or there is something bigger than us, but I don't want to acknowledge that means he has authority over. I'm fine if he's bigger. I just don't want the authority that goes along with it.
Yeah.
So that's part of it. I've talked about the scapegoat mechanism before. So there's like a anthropological, reason for it, right? It simulates what's called sacred violence. So that's part of it.
Well, Renee was also wondering on the corollary. In Islam, it's Ishmael is the one that that Abraham's bringing to sacrifice. In our tradition, it's Isaac. But either way, it's your freaking son. And you've been plagued your whole life with infertility.
Right.
Now you finally have 2 kids.
Right.
But that's all you've got.
That's all you got.
So regardless of which one is actually being sacrificed, this is a human life. And over top of that, it is your actual child.
Yeah.
How would Abraham have received it? Was sacrificing one of your own children that unusual in the region? So culturally,
not wholly unusual. So
okay, so because that's what she's asking.
Right.
Has this have been an expected call from God?
Yeah, it would have. Yes, that's part of it. It's part of that etiology thing. It's like this kind of would have been like, oh, this sucks, but okay.
But it happens.
Okay. Right?
So from Abraham's perspective, it wouldn't have been
the ancient world
horribly unusual.
Right. The ancient world is filled with stories of before you embark on the big thing or get the big thing, you have to sacrifice one of your kids. Right. This is actually how the Iliad starts. Right. If you remember the Trojan War story, right? Yeah. It starts with Agamemnon literally sacrificing his daughter before they go and conquer Troy. That's thousands of years later, and that's still like within their realm
of thinking.
So there's probably a world where it probably made it sucked, but okay, God has promised me this land. Before I get it, okay, I've got to make the big sacrifice.
So Isaac or Ishmael,
right? So
they're worth it,
right? So Isaac, come on, let's go.
Yeah. Well, Steve said during service, it was probably a really long walk back to the tent between Isaac and Abraham.
Yeah, right.
And very quiet.
Right. Bible doesn't say much about that. They don't. Sarah and Abraham die not too long after this story. There's not much said about them after this.
Yeah, was it under questionable circumstances?
No, but I'm not sure how much more you could. This is where the Bible, because it's the ancient world, and they are so not interested in interior states of mind that you almost wish somebody had given a little bit more of the interior state of mind. So yeah
especially from either Isaac or Ishmael's viewpoint, I would love, as they're finally being released from the altar, what they're thinking about their dad.
Right.
Steve asks in the reading, the angel of God said that Abraham showed he feared God enough to sacrifice his son. So Steve's saying, so this wasn't out of love and faithfulness. If it's out of fear.
Well, fear is respect, right? So awe might be a better. When you hear fear in the Old Testament, you should hear awe, like respect.
Is this a translation issue again?
No,
what's the original Hebrew?
It is because they don't mean terror. We equate fear and terror in English. They're not quite synonyms in the ancient world. Fear is, there's this whole psychological concept of fear that what they mean is proper awe or reverence,
So it's not cowering, shaking and quivering in a corner.
It might be, but shaking why? Not because I'm terrorized of the monster, but because I have encountered I've had a raw encounter with the holy, you know.
With something so awesome.
Right, with something so awesome, so direct, so, you know, it should kill me, but it's not, you know, its very holiness should burst my head open, you know, like a melon, you know, but it's not, and I've encountered this thing, you know, so there's this, it's hard to explain because it's, like, it is trembling, it is, I'm scared, you know, but it's also, like, respect and awe and, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So there's way more there. A lot of problems with English.
Well, I think it's, you know, it's we almost just don't have a good word for it. You know, if you go out into the middle of the country and you stare at the night sky, like, there can be both a fear and an awe there, right? Of like, and they're connected to the same thing. It's fear over just how vanishingly small you actually are, you know, in the grand scheme of things, looking out at seeing the Milky Way galaxy, and, you know, that's terrifying, you know, but there's also an awe there of, look at how mighty and majestic, you know, but both those feelings go together in the same thing, right? Does that make sense?
It does. It does. And it brings me back to Abraham himself. Here you've got this fear, this awe, this respect.
Yeah.
All mashed into one word. And yet Abraham doesn't have any trouble outside of this incident. This incident, he does it.
Yeah.
He's willing to sacrifice his own kid. Aside from this one, though, Abraham is the first recorded outright sass in history. I mean, he sasses God relentlessly. He argues with God. And more critically, Abraham wins.
Sort of. Yeah. You know? he gets God down.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sodom and Gomorrah still get destroyed the next chapter.
Yeah. But under conditions.
Yeah.
Now, right. You know, Abraham has ameliorated a lot here.
Yeah.
So that I can go very theologically or just, you know, biographically or comically.
Yeah.
And there are points in Abraham's story where I do feel like this was meant to get laughs when this was all an oral tradition.
Right, sort of, yeah. It was, absolutely, yeah.
What does that mean about Abraham? That he really didn't feel the need to hold back in arguing with God?
Yeah, I mean, it's, I guess I would say that's the nature of actual faith, right? Like, I mean, it says something that God names the whole people of Israel, which means you wrestle with me. You know, you wrestle with God. Like, you know, like, if God had wanted automatons, like, he could have gotten automatons, right? Like creation praises God just by being, you know, and that's not, he's a God of relationship, right? And so from the very beginning, he's a God of relationship. And so part of faith is the real relationship, but part of real relationship is being able to say, one moment, you know, can I get a footnote here or something, you know, and he knows his limits. He doesn't get them all the way down to one, you know, that's a part of it too. I think the people who do that know their limits and they're almost always arguing with God toward God's mercy. That's the other part, you know, arguing with God towards vengeance never gets you very far. Jonah tried that. It got him an object lesson, not what he wanted, you know, but
he became an appetizer.
Right. Yeah. But arguing with God toward mercy is almost always successful in scripture, you know.
Yeah.
God will listen to that one.
Well, another aspect with Abraham and or the changing God. When did God start radiating so that he burned your face like he does with Moses? You know, Moses gets a sunburn hanging around God, but Abraham, you know, brings God into the tent. They have dinner together, all that.
Yeah.
And even, the whole, was it Isaac or Jacob that, is wrestling God directly. Yeah. They don't get all sunburned like Moses does.
Right.
So when does God have so much power and energy that he radiates and people burn in his midst?
Yeah, I mean, it's what is in what form is he coming? I think is, like all those texts talk about God and also God as angel. Like the wrestling story, right? It says it is God, but it's also an angel.
Yeah.
like there's a not quite clear like incarnational thing going on, which is different than Moses, who gets this just direct blast of the Almighty.
It makes me,
as he actually is,
makes me think of Tony Stark, whether he's actually in the Iron Man suit or whether it's one of the robotic Iron Man suits.
Right, and he's talking through it, right?
Yeah.
But similar, that's not a bad way to think about it. Yeah.
I like that. I can wrap my head around the Tony Stark analogy.
Yeah, I mean, right. Yes.
So, given all this, right? He's in the period of recorded history, Abraham.
Yeah.
Is Abraham considered generally myth, legend, historical, or simply metaphor?
I mean, it's almost impossible to know because outside of scripture,
there's no.
It's not like we have a receipt that said Abraham stopped for gas here.
There's no clay tablet from Ur that has any recording.
Right. Says right. And I'm not sure, we don't have most of that history, like we only know snippets, right? Like, so like, in some ways we have about as good as evidence that Abraham existed as we do for almost anybody pre-1000 BC existed, right? It's
although
all,
we do have these fascinating, and that's what I find fascinating about the archaeology, when we
other than
recovered tablets.
Other than pyramids, and big things like that, right? Like, and tablets from royal officials, and
well, and that's what's interesting, right? Because we have,
or Ian Nasir,
we've been finding
even salesmen, right?
Right, with receipts, recipes.
Yeah, we do have that. We have nothing that says Abraham, but even then, like, there's a limit to like,
how deep that
goes, right? And so even if you found a tablet that said Abraham, how would you know that was that Abraham? Right? Like, how would you even know? I don't think there would be a way to tell.
Where do we start having historic corroboration of biblical events? Is it with like Solomon?
Later divided kingdom period is when we start really getting it. During the divided kingdom, we have steles from, which are these giant pillars which record events from other kingdoms in the later monarchy divided kingdom period. There's a stele from Moab, I think, or Syria, one of the two, that talks about receiving emissaries from the house of David, in Judah, right? And so that's when you start getting that kind of stuff. We get recorded history of Israel, like King Ahab, it's when we start getting that period, recorded history.
Yeah.
So
we have the incident. Speaking of recorded history, I mean, we have the whole story of them going to Egypt.
Yeah.
And Egypt keeps popping up now and again, which again just tells us they were the United States of that era. They were the big influential superpower. Because we keep getting all these, they go to Egypt, they hide in Egypt.
Egypt represents empire in scripture, in the Old Testament.
You go to Egypt to get work. It's a land of opportunity.
Right, right.
What was it about Abraham and Sarah that they were able to actually get the attention of the royal family?
Well, he's wealthy, right? Like, he's not poor, so here's a livestock guy. Here's a livestock guy with wandering into your territory, so there's that. He's also, Abraham's probably what we call a Semitic nomad, which is this group of people that wander around kind of on the outskirts of civilization. They're nomads, they're herders, and they usually cause trouble. They usually invade, conquer, pillage, so you could kind of see how he'd probably be viewed as like a borderline national security threat, kind of like a migrant caravan freaks some people out, he would probably kind of be viewed in that.
And in this case, because he's got wealth behind him.
Is he the vanguard of some, because they would come in waves and just kind of burn everything to the ground. And, so is he the vanguard of some trouble that we got to mobilize the army? Oh, it's just this one dude, he's wealthy, take him to Pharaoh, blah, 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 goes from there.
Yeah. So why the need, maybe that is the answer to the question of why he felt like he had to be duplicitous and pass Sarah off as his sister.
Yeah, it doesn't really say. The Bible just says he was afraid of Pharaoh killing him, to get him, which is something.
And this may be why then.
Right. And, regardless of whether that's why they're living gods, or at least they think they are, they do that. It's not irrational in that regards,
So again, given that framework.
Yeah.
Okay, we only have time for one more question. Mm-hmm. This has gone by pretty quickly. So I'm going to go to one of the biggies.
Okay.
At least for men throughout the entire planet and history of men. Yeah. Why did Abraham invent circumcision? And why did it become required?
Well, it's the mark. It's the physical mark. Okay, here's the real. God says it's a physical mark to make you distinctive, right? And in the ancient world, people were naked a lot more frequently than they are today.
So they didn't have the prohibitions and inhibitions that we have now.
Well, there was more opportunity, right? Like you're wearing less, like a tunic is just a sheet over you,
and you're not wearing a loincloth under it.
Yeah, you're not really wearing a loincloth under it, right? Okay. So like, and it's a dress. So to run, like men would raise the tunic and run. It's why they didn't do it very often. It's very undignified. But you'd just be naked under there, like,
So there would be lots of opportunity to see that mark.
Then. Yeah, right. Okay. Right. And that's the point, is that it would be something people would see. It would be very identifiable who's Jew and who's not very quickly,
So why come up with such a painful way of doing it? Like a tattoo might be nice.
He's not a tame God. That's all we get. That is, he's not a tame God. That's the, don't know.
Wow. I mean, I'm even thinking of things like the execution of it. Like, it seems like it would take a while to be able to figure out basically a bris without getting infection and excess pain. This is not something I want to be the beta tester for.
He's not a tame God. That's all I. As Eli says in the book of Samuel, let the Lord see what does good to him.
All right. I can't say as I'm happy with the answer, but
I know. Well, and there's no reason. I mean, God could have chosen 100 different ways, but he didn't. I tend to think it has something to do with, our Reformed friends have a doctrine called progressive revelation, that God reveals himself progressively, not all at once, but he reveals himself in a way that makes sense to the people at the time. So all I can say is I'm pretty confident that there's some progressive revelation. It made sense to them.
To that culture at that time.
Yeah. It wouldn't make sense to us, but we're not, I mean, it makes sense now because for different reasons, but to start it was part of how God was communicating himself, so.
Yeah, and you're definitely going to remember that pain, I'll tell you.
Yes, you are.
That's a communication you will not forget
You will
as an
not
adult.
forget it. Yep.
All right, well, on that uplifting note, thank you, and I think we're back again next week, right? No interference?
I don't think so. Yeah.
All right, cool.
So, all right.
So more questions, get them ready, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.
Peace.
Now I feel like doing the police squad fake freeze frame.